On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, amid violent riots, the Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office meets the press. How can Hong Kong pacify the months-long protests? And the first Chinese company launches satellites into space. Can Chinese ventures catch up with their Western rivals? Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing. We start with the fallout from Sunday's protests in Hong Kong. According to a local newspaper, 49 people have been arrested in Sunday's protest in central Hong Kong for illegal assembly and possession of weapons. On Monday, Beijing sent warnings against the violent activities and formed support for the Hong Kong SAR government and the police in Hong Kong. Take a look.
The first press conference held by the Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office since the protests began nearly 2 months ago. Beijing is calling on people in Hong Kong to safeguard the rule of law.
The recent developments in Hong Kong, especially the acts of violence by a small number of radical activists, have seriously undermined Hong Kong's prosperity and stability, seriously challenged the rule of law and the public order of Hong Kong, and seriously threatened the life and property security of Hong Kong residents. They've also touched the bottom line of the principle of one country, two systems, and can't be tolerated.
On Sunday, tens of thousands of protesters dressed in black set off in several directions, blocking major roads with some dismantling street signs and fences. Another violent protest occurred near Yuen Long on Saturday. Several policemen were injured in clashes with protesters and nearly a dozen people arrested. The protesters are mainly young people outfitted with gas masks and body armor. Since June, demonstrations evolved from peaceful gathering to violent attacks against both the police and the public, causing injuries. The demonstrations began over legislation that would have allowed the transfer of criminal suspects to jurisdictions including the Chinese mainland. Beijing has voiced strong support to the police and said violent protesters must be swiftly punished.
For more on the latest development in Hong Kong, joining us in Hong Kong, Cheng Sui-Wai, a senior lecturer at Hong Kong Baptist University. Professor, welcome to the program. In Beijing, we also like to welcome Victor Gao Zhikai, Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization, a current affairs commentator. Welcome to the both of you. Let me go to you, Professor Cheng, first. What do you make of the statements made in Beijing this time by the spokesperson from the Hong Kong and Macau office of the State Council?
I think today the spokesperson, both the Hong Kong Macau office spokespersons talked about the basic sense, and also they sent out the signal very confidently, believing that the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region government under the leadership of Carrie Lam can find a way to solve the problem. So it's a very confident tone. And in the past several days, there are rumors and there are speculations that probably the central authorities would allow Ms. Lam to step down or do anything, or some of the officials will be accountable or taking into account for these kind of riots and other things. So far, we did not see any specific mentioning or any kind of inclination that the central government will direct the Hong Kong government to do anything or to let anybody from the leadership to step down.
I see. Mr. Gao, your take, very briefly.
Well, I think this afternoon's press conference by the State Council Hong Kong Macau Affairs Office is a very important one. Why? Because this is the first time that the central government has taken an official position on this very important development in Hong Kong for about 8 weeks. Personally, I wish that the press conference would have happened earlier, but I would say that the spokespersons rightly pointed out the importance of abide by the rule of law, the unconditional support of the central government for Carrie Lam, and also the police force in Hong Kong, and also it called on the people in Hong Kong to support the SAR government as well as the police force, and also to prevent further chaos in Hong Kong. So I would say this has set the tone for how the central government would deal with the situation and the evolving situation in Hong Kong.
Mr. Chung, there has been quite a number of days when you see the situation escalated over the weeks. Now, which stage would you say, as someone living in Hong Kong right now, and I'm sure as someone teaching journalism in your university, observe the situation quite closely, which stage is it? How much role is the Hong Kong SAR government extending its power in a way in order to calm the situation down?
I think so far the Hong Kong government, in fact, did not explicitly supported the Hong Kong police as strongly, as confidently as the central government did today. So the central government would call on the people in Hong Kong and the government to stop the violence and to restore peace. And this they consider as the top priority. So I think the SAR government should try to do this and try to support this police force to get the society back to normal. And I think the biggest problem is not with the just the violence. It's, in the meantime, it's a kind of media war. I think the SAR government lost the battle in the communication between the government and the general public, because they did not come out to explain all these things from the very beginning. And this is a fatal mistake. In today's world, you need to communicate with the public constantly and measure the pulse of the public.
I see.
And I think they did poorly in this way.
I see. So what's next, Mr. Gao? If you read closely the statements made by the spokesperson from the Hong Kong and Macau office from the State Council today, together with the mixed messages sent out in Hong Kong by various officials of the SAR government.
Now, I think of top priority right now for the situation in Hong Kong is to bring back stability and the respect for the rule of law. And in this part, a very important part is the respect of the law enforcement agency, because without police officers really doing their job in keeping peace and stability in Hong Kong, how would you be able to protect the rule of law? And without rule of law, nothing positive will exist in Hong Kong. There will be chaos. So I think this is the top priority.
How does that work? May I go to Mr. Chung, since he is in Hong Kong right now? What is the relations between the police force and the SAR government? One would believe that the SAR government has the ultimate power to exercise the capability of the police force. But I understand in Hong Kong things are a little bit more complicated than just a clean-cut issue. So, Mr. Chung, help our viewers from all over the world to understand what is the relations between the SAR government and the police force, and also the capabilities of police force to exercise their mission and their task, responsibility in Hong Kong.
I think the Hong Kong police force, as the central authorities believed, and the spokesman mentioned today, that they are quite professional, and they tolerated a lot and suffered a lot, since some of their police officers and their family members' personal information have been publicly disclosed and humiliated and even bullied on the internet. So I think this is a very crucial time that the SAR government should communicate with the public and try to build up the morale of the police force, as well as letting the people know that the police are trying to fulfill their jobs, and making sure that the Hong Kong is still a very safe place. As many of the people here believe that some of the places, if there are too many rioters or too many demonstrators, people would not come out, and some of the shops were closed. So in that sense, Hong Kong is not as safe as we used to like to be.
Therefore, Mr. Chung, I have to follow up once again because you're now based in Hong Kong. We understand from numbers released by some universities in Hong Kong as a third party in a way to do the survey of the service industry and also of the tourism industry. The numbers are not necessarily that beautiful in recent weeks. So people also worry about the financial sector, which is the pillar of Hong Kong's economy worldwide. So what does that mean, the current situation? On the one hand, you have to take care of the economy. On the other hand, you also need to take care of the concerns of the general public. So let people speak out, but speak out in a way that it is abiding the rule of law. So, Mr. Chung, I would assume this is quite a complex mix of tasks for the SAR government now.
Yes, it's very complicated. The business community have spoke out about this, and different sectors of the society also spoke out. However, the Hong Kong SAR government has not fully answered all these questions or provided some detailed explanations for their actions, and their communication is always too slow and too little. So in that sense, you cannot make the people believe you. So that is why people rather to believe that the police used extra or unnecessary forces, or the leadership in Hong Kong was not in favor of doing certain things, or the police wanted to do. So they try to figure out what is the real situation. But the Hong Kong government needs to explain it to the public.
Is it only the Hong Kong government that needs to explain to the public? Now, Mr. Gao, Hong Kong is one country, two system under that umbrella. So the situation in Hong Kong is different as to the governance, how the governance is done here on the mainland. So under one country, two systems, what is the responsibility of the SAR government? What power does it have? What are some of the specific responsibilities and rights of the SAR government as well as the chief executive? So are these things clear?
Well, I think it's very clear. If you read the basic law, there are very clear provisions for how the one country, two system rule need to be implemented in Hong Kong. And as for the division of work between the Hong Kong SAR government versus the central government, there is very clearly defined rules. For example, normally everything is vested in the Hong Kong government, and the police force is one department of the Hong Kong government. So I think, and I hope, there will be very close solidarity between the Hong Kong government in general and the police force in particular. Now, between the Hong Kong government and the central government, normally the Hong Kong government will take care of all the law enforcement and many other aspects of the government affairs in Hong Kong, unless the Hong Kong government reaches the conclusion that there are emergency cases, for example, big natural disasters or loss of civil order and civil stability, then they will call upon the central government for help. And the central government can, at the request of the Hong Kong government, make many decisions. And in addition, if the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress in the central government reaches the conclusion that there are threats to the Chinese sovereignty in Hong Kong and there are emergency cases, then they can make decisions on their own, which will be applicable to Hong Kong. So I think the division of work and the process are well spelled out.
I see.
Anyone who has any doubt about that need to read the basic law.
One of the things is, what about the one country, two systems? Now, when you look at the international media coverage, Mr. Chung, some of them was talking about concerns in Hong Kong, whether the principle of one country, two systems, which is the principle in which the Hong Kong SAR government was established, in which Hong Kong returned to China. Now, whether that has been exercised and has been abided by over the past more than 20 years in Hong Kong, and should people have concerns about whether that has been done. So, Mr. Chang, what's your observation?
I think as for the implementation of the one country, two systems frame, the formula, this one has been done in the last 23 years. However, the Hong Kong public opinion is very divided. It's a kind of beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Some people would say one side violated this system, and the other side would say that everything is carried out according to the law. And so in this particular incident, for this riots to start, people believed that the implementation of the law and the one country, two systems have been violated because of this bill. So this is the cause of this. However, in recent days, people have turned their attention to different things, and different people see the news reports on TV or on the internet. They will make their own judgment. Today, we see the opinion divided because everybody would like to see some of the things that they believe are true. In this post-truth era, we don't really can define what is purely facts or truth.
Interesting. What is purely facts? Facts are facts. Whether truth is arguable or not in one eyes or the other, that could be debated. Mr. Gao, one country, two system, that is the principle. So whether that principle is clearly defined, if it is, whether the implementation of that principle could also be clearly monitored and also described. What do you think?
I think, first of all, the one country, two system principle was the genius stroke when Deng Xiaoping and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher reached a big compromise which smoothly transferred the sovereignty over Hong Kong back to China in 1997. I would say the one country, two system principle remains the cornerstone of all the political system in Hong Kong, and if there are defects, for example, in the implementation of that, we should not blame the one country, two system principle. We should reflect on where, for example, either the people or the government or whatever erred in the implementation. And I would say if we strictly abide by the one country, two system principle, then Hong Kong will have a better tomorrow. And this remains the cornerstone, and everyone needs to strictly abide by the basic law, strictly abide by the one country, two system principle, and very importantly, rule of law is the cornerstone of Hong Kong. Everyone needs to abide by the rule of law.
Victor Gao Zhikai, Cheng Sui Wai, thank you so much. Let's see what's going to happen in the next stage of development in Hong Kong. You're watching World Insight, still to come on our program. The first Chinese private company successfully launches satellites into space. Can Chinese ventures catch up to their Western partners? Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing. For the very first time in China, a privately funded company has successfully sent satellites into orbit recently, boosting the country's commercial space industry. A private space race, some say, is heating up around the world, with startups around the world building satellites, rockets, and even lunar rovers. The final frontier is becoming the place for private tech titans to shoot for the stars. So will the Chinese startups emerge as important players to shape the future of space exploration? Let's take a look at the latest development.
The commercialization of space is breaking new ground. Now the race is on for who will take the lead. Last week, for the first time in China, Beijing-based startup iSpace successfully launched a rocket called Hyperbola-1, carrying 2 satellites into orbit, marking a new chapter in China's private aerospace sector. For over a decade, Elon Musk's SpaceX dominated headlines with technological breakthroughs in commercial space launch. But Chinese private companies are also making big moves. At the end of 2018, China had more than 100 registered space companies, with more preparing to enter the mix. A brand new space age is dawning. After half a century since man first walked on the moon, most new missions are now launched by private companies. The number of space launches worldwide, including the private sector, skyrocketed from just 2 in 1957 to over 450 last year. While space travel might still sound like science fiction, the private space industry is taking us boldly where no one has gone before.
For more on Chinese companies competing in the aerospace industry in Chicago, we have Ryan Faith, Principal of Excellent, I hope to pronounce like that, Strategies, joining us in Santa Barbara. John C. Mackins, founder and president of Mackins Space Technology, and in our Beijing studio, Yang Yuguang, professor at the China Aerospace Industry and Science Corporation, also member of the Chinese Society of Astronauts. Welcome to our program, the three of you. Let me start by asking you, Mr. Yang, so how big a success is it with the recent launch, successful one? I understand 2 earlier ones failed, Mr. Yang.
Well, this is a very meaningful launch and a very important launch for the private companies, and not only for the space guys, and also for the whole space industry. I have a friend from the interstellar glory space, and this gave me this first day cover. So you can see the rocket. It's a although it is a very small one, but it is the first successful orbital launch of China's private companies. And because you know that before that we already have 2 attempts to entering the orbit, although they have also very excellent technologies, but it is really a pity. Still, the space activities is a very high risky activities. So it's natural that they have been failed. But in the future, I believe the market for the private companies to provide the launch services will booming in China.
I see. Mr. Faith, on the other hand, we see earlier successful attempts by the counterparts in other countries, United States included. So are we going to see more cooperation among the private sectors in terms of outer space exploration, since the governments are having some problems talking to one another?
Almost certainly. You know, it's the nature over the long term for companies to find ways to work with each other through private sector interactions. Space is going to be, that will probably happen in space, but it'll take a long time because countries are very sensitive and very careful about the technologies, and so they put a lot of restrictions on what companies may or may not do when they're interacting with other partners.
So what are the most sensitive areas, Mr. Faith, if you could clarify for our international viewers who might not be experts in the field, for the private sectors coming from different countries to cooperate on?
Well, essentially, all rockets are the same thing as intercontinental ballistic missiles, functionally. So if you can launch a rocket into space, you can launch a missile payload to the other side of the world. And so that's really the big central problem. Beyond that, there's questions about electronic circuits that are designed to operate in a high radiation environment of space, have military applications. There's a whole slew of very high technology applications that are considered sensitive by most spacefaring nations.
I see. So, Mr. Mackins, if I could go to you about the latest development, are we going to see, as a result of this, more competition or more possibility for co-research and also cooperation?
So I think the clear answer is both. There will be continuing competition in providing launch services, even though the market will continue to grow. I think the number of companies entering the market is going to grow even faster. So there will be intense competition among companies across the world to provide launch services to the growing marketplace. However, in space operations, in space development, space exploration, I think there are tremendous opportunities for cooperation, particularly with regard to what is called cislunar space, the space in and around the Earth and the Moon, and involving the lunar surface exploration, operations, and eventual development.
Very interesting over there. A lot of the areas to be explored. But you know, when you think about that, the different generations of private sectors involved into the outer space exploration, Mr. Yang, you heard about the Lockheed Martins, of course, and also some of the other important companies like Boeing. Now you also hear the next generation, SpaceX, by Elon Musk and some of the others, all looking for opportunities. Now you also have the runner-up, like Chinese one, participating. So how do you see the different generations of private sector involvement? What does it mean for the overall outer space exploration worldwide?
Well, we've talked about the competition. Competition is good. So you see, more and more players come into this field. Although the old players mostly invested by the government, so they can have the chance to develop their own production line and their own technologies. But in recent days, because you know that the space technologies becomes more and more practical and more important for the economy, so the huge market appears. And because of this market, because of the needs of customers, more companies come into this field. And they have, of course, more companies come and more competitions. And competitions brings innovations. Competitions brings high efficiency. So for this generation, about your question, the private companies is more flexible, and also there are more power to drive them for innovation.
But Mr. Mackins, would there still be concern of monopoly? Because this is going to take a lot of money, as you may know, and it also takes the support, semi-support at least, coming from the government-sponsored agencies, space agencies in different countries in order to, like the private sector, to be successful at the very start at least. So are we going to see new generations of a monopoly? Is that a concern?
It might emerge in the longer term, but at the moment, I think the ecosystem, the ecology of new space, of all these space companies looking at completely new opportunities, is extremely robust and very rich in lots of small companies, lots of big companies, all trying to get involved in exploring and in particularly developing space around the Earth, and space, in particular the Moon. I think that in the long run, there might be the risk of monopoly, but in the near term, it's going to be extremely exciting and very flexible, with too many players for any one company to dominate.
It is going to be exciting. No one doubts about that. Yet, Mr. Faith, would government relations mean the most important factor for these private companies to be successful and for their missions to be successful? Because to start with, they have to have this launch license, as they say, in order to start any of these operations. So it seems that they have to butter the government pretty well. They have to have very good relations with the government. But what would that mean for the private sectors worldwide, Mr. Faith?
I think at the outset, it might be a little bit mixed. The close engagement with the government can create some technical cooperation or some technical assistance, but on the other hand, it also can create a lot of restrictions. And I think a thing that private companies around the world are very much interested in doing is figuring out how to get regulations streamlined. If you consider the very first space launches, they're all very much run by governments. They're very unique events and very rare events. For the private sector to be successful, they have to become a commonplace. So in the longer term, it might be something more like airplanes taking off from an airport, where there is a relatively modest government intervention, but we're a long way from that yet.
What kind of regulation streamline are you talking about, Mr. Faith? Can you give us some specific examples? Well,
the big one, particularly in the U.S., is the regulation of launch and reentry. So it's the Federal Aviation Administration regulates rockets that are leaving the Earth's atmosphere and returning to the Earth's atmosphere. The new frontier for regulatory discussion and debate, at least in the U.S., is how you regulate activity that occurs in space. If a satellite needs to speak to Earth, then it goes to one part of the government. If a satellite has a camera that can look at Earth, it goes to another part of government. If somebody wants to manufacture something, then that would be another part of government. So there's a lot of debate, particularly in the U.S., about how we can condense and streamline this process and make it something that's favorable to private sector activity and does not hinder it.
Interesting, the examples you give in the United States. What about here in China? I mean, Mr. Yang, I know this is only the very first time that the orbital attempt launch has been successful, but still, you know, that's a question facing the private sector. What kind of regulation they would need the government or regulate bodies to streamline so that you can see more private ones to be successful?
Well, I think this is a very common question. There is no difference between different countries or different companies, either it's a state-owned company or a private company. So because according to the laws, the government or local government of the launch is responsible for the damages either in space or on the ground. So if anything happened, anything wrong happened, so the government must pay for the loss, and also because before this, the government must consider about who will pay for that. So for the local law, either a state-owned company or a private company, they must get a license from the government to avoid these kind of things happen, and also do the right things after these kind of things happen. And also, you know that these are concerned about some security problems, and also there are other problems of resources such as the frequency. Such as the orbit. So the company who launched the satellites or launched the rocket must get license from the corresponding international organizations.
I see. Here comes the interesting part, isn't it, Mr. Mackins? I understand there are international regulations that everybody follows, but as we see more and more areas for exploration by the private sector, is there an issue of how various governments be able to work together to streamline the international regulations, probably more areas of international regulations? In the context of geopolitical competition, as some see it, is that going to happen?
Yeah, I think that it's less. I actually believe that this kind of intergovernmental coordination with regard to launch regulatory matters is less crucial than the same kind of cooperation with regard to missions and operations and ventures beyond the launch part of the overall activity. So, and I think that these kinds of discussions are just now getting started. When we have missions like the Chang'e 4, not one spacecraft from China launching on the moon, but instead you have multiple spacecraft all operating in close proximity at the south pole of the moon.
Yeah.
How do they cooperate? How do they non-interfere, but also have the opportunity to support one another? I think this is where the really exciting changes in regulatory matters will come forward in just the next few years.
Fascinating. Mr. Faith, about that, what's your thought?
Well, the U.S. Congress, last Congress, worked on a couple laws to create conditions for regulating outer space activity, to link the international obligations that each nation has to things that are happening in the private sector. And this kind of activity in Europe and Asia and in the United States is forcing a lot of very thoughtful discussion and very, very thoughtful debate. And I think it's correct to say that within a few years, nations are going to start engaging more closely to find out how they can best work together. It's a little bit like nations cooperating on rules at sea for ships. But right now we're all sort of discovering the first elements and first steps, and so it's still a learning process.
Still a learning process, yes indeed, but we see a big necessity for that, to be able to come up with some consensus about it. For example, let me just give you an example. Even as someone who does not know very well about the outer space, I understand there are issues of concern, for example, about the debris in the outer space. More human exploration, more commercial exploration definitely would mean more debris in the outer space. But who is going to regulate that? Who's going to be responsible for that if it is an international cooperation project? So who will be the one shouldering the responsibilities? And who will clean it? And what is the process of cleaning it? Is there an international standard for it? Who will apply and abide by it? All these are very important questions, Mr. Yang. And it's a long list I can give, even longer than that I just said. So, Mr. Yang, who's going to be responsible for that? Are we have good ones now?
Well, this is really a big question, and also there are many international conferences and also international organizations discussing about this problem. The debris is a very serious threat to all spacecraft in orbit. So, you know that for all kinds of launches, such as this one we talked about, after the mission is complete, the launch license requires the company who developed this rocket to do something to avoid the more debris. So you see that for reducing of the debris, we do all kinds of measures. But if any damage happened to, for instance, if some debris collide with a functional satellite, so there are payment for this kind of loss. As I mentioned, before the launch, the satellite, the owner of the satellite, and also the owner of the rocket must buy some kind of insurance to pay for this.
But that is already the worst scenario, isn't it, Mr. Mackins? Because we understand there is an issue about the outer space environment, just like the environment that we care about the Earth as well. The more exploration, it means more debris, but we have to avoid the escalation of building up these debris from the very beginning, or at least from the current stage. So do we think in the long term, or we only think in the worst scenario at this moment?
Well, clearly, we have to think about both the nearer term and the long term, and not only about space debris in low Earth orbit, but about debris and waste everywhere that we will be operating over the coming years. So I think there are a number of opportunities. Certainly the UN COPUOS, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, will be an important body in coordinating these discussions. Also, the International Academy of Astronautics is another that can play a key role in facilitating the conversations. I think ultimately, in regulatory terms, for the near term, that real action has to be taken by each government in accordance with high-level agreements or discussions, even if they are informal, within these non-governmental or United Nations-based organizations. Otherwise, there's just no time to take action in a quick enough way to really affect these near-term challenges. Especially with all the literally hundreds of missions that are planned during the next several years, launch missions that are planned over the next several years. It's just that time is critical.
It is critical. Before we go, I do have a question to ask. It's also legitimate, I guess, for me and many others to ask that question, which is outer space exploration, particularly by the private sector, whether it's space tourism or others, going to be only a rich man's club activity? When we have all the access and rights to the outer space, are we going to have equal opportunities? Mr. Face, very briefly from you.
If I can change subjects a little bit, is one of the things I do want to mention about the debris issue is that that's not an issue that's resolved.
Yes, we have already talked a lot about that, but may I have you to answer that question too, about whether it's a rich man's club or
Sorry
not?
about that.
Very briefly, if you can, 30 seconds. We have very little time left.
Right, very quickly, is that the most powerful and richest people in the world right now are the President of the United States, the Premier of China, Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and Donald Trump. Those are the most powerful, wealthy people right now.
I'm not sure whether they're wealthy, but certainly powerful.
They have access to wealth. They have access to power. And so over long periods of time, As competition increases, costs should reduce, and it should open up for everybody.
Okay, Mr. Yang, your thought?
Well, for suborbital launch, everybody, including you and me, has
Very
the chance
briefly.
to be a space tourist. But for the orbital tourism, only a game of billionaires.
I see. Mr. Mackins?
So opening space to everyone is obviously the long-term vision. And there have been some excellent studies shown this is like the chicken and the egg problem, which came first. And in order to open space to the broad public, first you have to have much lower cost launch, and that comes through high value, more frequent missions. So I think the path to the public
Running out of time. For now, I want to
the
thank the three of you, John
rich.
Mackins, Ryan Faith, and Yang Yuguang. Really appreciate it. Sorry for interrupting, but we are really running out of time. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for more insights across China and the world.